In the heart of a bustling Latin American neighborhood, a devout Christian wife, adored by her community for her seemingly flawless life, hides a dark secret. Her manipulative affair with her father-in-law sets off a chain of events leading to murder. This is the story of Camila Mendoza, a woman whose obsession with power, control, and manipulation spirals into a deadly tragedy that shakes a community to its core. Camila Mendoza, 35, appeared to live the kind of life that others admired. She had the perfect image of a Christian wife, someone who attended church every Sunday and was involved in every community event. People would often comment on her devotion to her family, especially to her husband Daniel, who worked tirelessly to provide for them. He ran the family's chain of grocery stores, which his father, Alejandro Mendoza, had founded years ago. While Daniel was focused on growing the business, Camila stayed at home, raising their children, Sophia and Gabriel, in the values of faith and responsibility. It was during these years that Alejandro, now 65, stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the business and took on a more spiritual role within the community. A respected elder in the church, Alejandro was known for his wisdom and guidance. After the death of his wife, he became even more dedicated to his faith, often leading Bible studies and counseling younger members of the church. He was a fixture at every community event, his quiet but powerful presence always felt, especially by those in need of advice or comfort. Camila had always admired Alejandro from a distance, seeing him as a pillar of strength and wisdom. Her marriage to Daniel, however, had become strained. By 2010, Daniel's focus on the grocery stores consumed nearly all his time. He would leave early in the morning and return late at night, always exhausted. Their conversations had dwindled to simple exchanges about bills and family matters. The warmth that once existed between them had long faded, leaving a void in Camila's life. Despite her strong outward appearance, Camila often felt lonely, unappreciated, and emotionally neglected. In those moments of isolation, Camila found herself turning to Alejandro. Initially, it was innocent, a conversation after church, a brief chat during family gatherings. But gradually, their talks deepened. By early 2011, their relationship had grown closer, as Alejandro often visited the house. With Daniel constantly busy at work, Alejandro became the male figure present at home, stepping into roles that Daniel couldn't fill. Camila appreciated how Alejandro always seemed to have time for her, unlike her husband. He listened to her frustrations, sympathized with her struggles, and offered words of encouragement. Alejandro, though deeply religious, was still a man grieving his late wife. He had never quite recovered from her death in 2009, and while he put on a brave face for the community, the pain lingered. He saw in Camila a kindred spirit, someone who also seemed to be suffering in silence. Their conversations often turned to personal struggles, with Alejandro confiding in Camila about his loneliness and how empty his house had felt since his wife passed. Camila, in turn, shared her own feelings of abandonment within her marriage, revealing how she often felt unseen and unappreciated by Daniel. These moments of shared vulnerability created an emotional bond between them. By the middle of 2011, Alejandro began visiting more frequently, under the guise of helping around the house or spending time with the grandchildren. However, it became clear to both of them that something was shifting. The boundaries that should have existed between a father-in-law and daughter-in-law began to blur. Camila, who had always been seen as the perfect Christian wife, began to relish the control she had over Alejandro. She could see the effect she had on him, how his demeanor softened when they were alone. Slowly, she started manipulating the situation, carefully feeding into Alejandro's emotions while maintaining her image as the devoted daughter-in-law. She would speak of how much she missed having a partner who truly cared for her, knowing that Alejandro, in his vulnerability, would fill that role. She would bring up spiritual discussions about temptation and guilt, knowing that Alejandro's religious convictions would keep him conflicted. By the end of 2011, their relationship had fully crossed the line from emotional to physical, though it was hidden under layers of secrecy and guilt. Alejandro, torn between his Christian beliefs and his growing feelings for Camila, struggled to reconcile the affair with his faith. Camila, however, had no such struggle. For her, the affair was about control. She enjoyed having power over Alejandro, a man who was once seen as untouchable in the community. It wasn't love that drove her actions, but a calculated desire for something more. She had grown tired of being the obedient wife, tired of living in Daniel's shadow. Alejandro, with his status and influence, became a means to an end. Everything took a dark turn. On March 6, 2014, when the police were called to the Mendoza residence, Daniel's body was found in the garage, his head brutally struck with a blunt object. The garage, once a quiet place where Daniel worked on his hobbies, was now a crime scene. Blood spattered across the concrete floor, and the neighborhood buzzed with whispers of tragedy. Looking back at early 2012, when their meetings became more frequent and their conversations took on a darker tone, Alejandro, racked with guilt, would often speak of ending the relationship, citing his fear of divine punishment. But Camila always managed to convince him otherwise, using her emotional hold on him to keep him in her grasp. She would remind him of how lonely they both were, how Daniel's neglect of her was unfair, and how they deserved happiness, even if it came at the cost of others. By this point, Alejandro was too deep in the affair to pull away. Camila's manipulation grew more sophisticated as time went on. She began subtly planting the idea that Daniel's absence wasn't just an inconvenience, but a burden on their lives. She would mention, in passing, how much easier life would be if Daniel weren't so focused on the business, if he weren't always in the way. Alejandro, vulnerable and emotionally drained, started to agree with her. He began to see Daniel not as his son, but as an obstacle to the life he and Camila could have together. By the middle of 2013, Camila had gained complete control over Alejandro. He was willing to do anything to keep her in his life, even if it meant betraying his own son. Camila, however, was already looking ahead. She saw an opportunity to not only free herself from her marriage, but to take over the family business. Alejandro was old, and she knew it wouldn't be long before the control of the grocery stores would pass to her. But first, Daniel had to be removed from the equation. As the affair continued to deepen, so did Camila's plans. By January 2014, she had started to carefully lay the groundwork for what would ultimately be Daniel's downfall. She was patient, calculating, and knew that her time was coming. What started as a secret affair had transformed into a deadly game of manipulation, with Alejandro as her pawn and Daniel as her target. On March 2, 2014, everything began to unravel in the Mendoza household. What had been brewing for years behind closed doors finally reached a breaking point. Camila, always calculated and in control, decided it was time to act. She knew that she could no longer maintain the facade of her life. Her affair with Alejandro had become more than just a secret. It was now a tangled mess of lies and manipulation that threatened to explode. Alejandro, struggling with the guilt of his actions, had grown hesitant. His faith was crumbling under the weight of what he had done, and the idea of committing an even greater sin, the murder of his own son, paralyzed him with fear. But Camila was relentless. She had spent years learning how to manipulate Alejandro, using his vulnerabilities against him. She knew how to push just hard enough to get what she wanted without scaring him away. She framed their situation in a way that allowed him to rationalize the unspeakable. Alejandro, torn between his love for Camila and the moral teachings he had once held so dear, felt trapped. He believed her when she said that Daniel's death was inevitable, that it was necessary for them to be free from the burden of secrecy. She convinced him that it was an act of divine justice, a way to cleanse their lives and start anew. Camila's plan was cold and calculated, just like everything else she did. She had thought through every detail, knowing that Alejandro's fragile state would make him easy to control. The plan wasn't overly complicated. It was simple, brutal, and would leave little evidence. She instructed Alejandro on what to do, reassuring him that it would all be over soon and that their lives could return to normal. No more secrets, no more guilt. Alejandro, though conflicted, felt the weight of his emotions overpower his sense of right and wrong. He was too deep in the affair, too lost in his love for Camila to turn back now. 4 days later, on the night of March 6, 2014, the plan came to a violent conclusion. The Mendoza family home, always bustling with activity and laughter, became the scene of a horrific crime. Daniel's lifeless body was found in the garage, his head shattered by a single devastating blow from a heavy object. Blood pooled around him, staining the concrete floor where he had once worked on his projects. The garage, a place where Daniel found peace in his hobbies, was now marked with violence and death. The discovery of Daniel's body sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Whispers of tragedy spread quickly, with neighbors gathering outside the Mendoza home, confused and fearful. The family was well known in the community, and their grocery stores had been a cornerstone of the neighborhood for years. The idea that such a brutal crime could happen to someone so respected was almost unthinkable. The police arrived quickly, led by Detective Luis Herrera, a man with years of experience handling violent crimes. As he walked through the scene, Herrera immediately knew that something was off. The house showed no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be missing. The idea of a robbery gone wrong, which had seemed plausible at first, quickly faded. This crime had been personal. Its brutality and precision suggested that it was committed by someone close to Daniel. By March 8, 2014, the investigation was well underway. The police began questioning everyone connected to Daniel, starting with his wife, Camila. She played the role of the grieving widow almost perfectly, but to Detective Herrera, something didn't feel right. Camilla appeared distraught, but her tears seemed too controlled, her emotions too measured. She spoke calmly, recounting how Daniel had come home late the night before the murder, saying she had gone to bed early, unaware of anything unusual. Despite her calm exterior, Herrera sensed that something was off. Camilla's behavior after the murder was odd. In the days following the tragedy, she didn't seem genuinely devastated. Her routine barely changed. While others in her situation might have been overwhelmed by grief, Camilla carried on as if nothing had happened. Her lack of visible emotion raised red flags for the detective. Something about her story didn't add up. Then, on March 20th, 2014, a breakthrough came in the form of a hidden phone found in Camilla's closet. The discovery shocked the investigation wide open. The phone contained explicit text messages between Camilla and Alejandro, messages that revealed the full extent of their affair. The texts were detailed, discussing their plans to eliminate Daniel, and even hinting at the specific day they would carry it out. Alejandro appeared hesitant in the messages, but it was clear that Camilla had orchestrated everything, pushing him to commit the unthinkable. With the new evidence in hand, Detective Herrera knew that the investigation had taken a critical turn. Alejandro's involvement was undeniable, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. Camilla, however, continued to deny everything, insisting that the messages were nothing more than fantasy. She portrayed herself as the victim, claiming that Alejandro had misunderstood their conversations. She painted a picture of a grieving man who had manipulated her, casting herself as an innocent woman caught in a tragic misunderstanding. But Alejandro's guilt was too great to hide. After the evidence surfaced, he began to unravel. By April 1st, 2014, Alejandro had withdrawn completely from the church and family gatherings. His once strong faith had shattered, and he could barely look his grandchildren in the eyes. The guilt of his actions consumed him. He no longer spoke about the future or offered advice to anyone. He was a shell of the man he once was, destroyed by his own sins. When the police finally brought him in for questioning on April 1st, his calm demeanor crumbled. Confronted with the phone records, Alejandro broke down, confessing to the affair. He spoke of how Camilla had drawn him in, how she had used his grief and vulnerability to manipulate him. He admitted that he had fallen for her, but he vehemently denied having anything to do with Daniel's murder. Alejandro described how the affair had spiraled out of control, but he couldn't bring himself to confess to the ultimate crime. Camilla, however, remained unshaken. As Alejandro confessed, she stayed composed, sticking to her story. She continued to claim that the messages were merely part of a fantasy, denying that they had ever intended to harm Daniel. She placed the blame squarely on Alejandro, insisting that he had acted out of his own desperation. But the overwhelming evidence, combined with Alejandro's broken confession, painted a different picture, one of a manipulative woman who had carefully crafted the downfall of her husband. As the case moved forward, the community was left to grapple with the shocking betrayal, wondering how such darkness could have hidden beneath the surface of such a respected family. On April 15, 2014, the quiet streets of the Latin American neighborhood buzzed with shock as both Camila and Alejandro were arrested for Daniel's murder. The news spread quickly, reaching every corner of the community. This was no ordinary crime. It was a betrayal that cut deep, shaking the very foundation of the Mendoza family. a family once admired for their faith and respectability. Camilla had always been viewed as the devoted Christian wife, while Alejandro had long been respected as a man of faith and wisdom. The revelation of their affair and involvement in Daniel's death left everyone in disbelief. The trial, which began in early 2015, became a spectacle, drawing people from all over. The courthouse was packed on every day of the proceedings, with neighbors, church members, and even local media filling the benches, eager to witness the downfall of a family that had once appeared so perfect. Cameras captured every moment, and reporters painted Camila as a cold, calculating woman who had manipulated an old man into killing her husband. Alejandro, the once proud and respected elder of the community, appeared broken. He looked older than his 65 years, his shoulders slumped and his face gaunt, as if the weight of his actions had drained the life from him. Throughout the trial, Alejandro broke down several times, overwhelmed with guilt. He admitted to the affair, recounting how Camilla had slowly gained control over him, drawing him deeper into her web of manipulation. He spoke of how he had never intended for Daniel to die, insisting that his involvement had spiraled out of control under Camilla's influence. His remorse was evident, and many in the courtroom felt pity for him. But his confession, while filled with regret, did little to absolve him of the crime. Camilla, on the other hand, presented a stark contrast. She sat in the courtroom with an air of confidence, showing no signs of the guilt that consumed Alejandro. Her demeanor was calm and composed, even as the gruesome details of the murder were laid out in front of her. She remained steadfast in her defense, claiming that Alejandro had acted on his own, that she had never intended for things to go so far. She insisted that their messages, which clearly outlined the plan to eliminate Daniel, were nothing more than a fantasy, misunderstood by an old man who had become obsessed with her. To the jury and those watching, Camilla's lack of remorse was chilling. Her cold detachment from the events made it clear that she was the mastermind behind it all. She had manipulated Alejandro from the beginning, exploiting his vulnerability and using his love for her as a tool to achieve her own goals. It became evident that Camilla's true intention was never love, but power. The power to control the Mendoza family, to take over the business, and to rid herself of the burdensome marriage that had kept her chained to a life of duty and routine. Alejandro, once a man of faith, had become a pawn in her calculated game, falling so deeply into sin that he could no longer see a way out. As the trial progressed, the emotional toll on the Mendoza family became more apparent. Sophia, now 17, and Gabriel, 13, were forced to sit through the painful details of their father's murder, while also coming to terms with the betrayal of their mother. Sophia, who had always admired her mother's strength and faith, was left devastated, unable to reconcile the woman who raised her with the cold manipulator being described in court. Gabriel, still so young, struggled to understand how his world had fallen apart. The loss of his father and the destruction of his family weighed heavily on him. Both children were left to grapple with the shame and confusion that followed them everywhere they went. On October 10th, 2015, the verdict was delivered. The jury, having listened to every detail of the case, found Camilla guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, a decision that brought some closure to the community, but left many lingering questions. Alejandro, though spared from a life sentence, faced his own punishment. He was convicted of lesser charges, but his reputation was destroyed, and his guilt would haunt him for the rest of his life. The church where he had once been a respected elder no longer welcomed him, and his family ties were irreparably broken. In the aftermath of the trial, the Mendoza family was left in ruins. The grocery business, once a source of pride for the family, struggled to stay afloat without Daniel's leadership. Alejandro's involvement in the scandal drove many customers away, and the community's trust in the family was shattered. The children, Sophia and Gabriel, were left to navigate their future without the guidance of their parents, both of whom were lost to them in very different ways. Sophia, already on the cusp of adulthood, carried the weight of the family's shame on her shoulders. She tried to remain strong for Gabriel, but the trauma of losing both her parents, one to murder and the other to the prison system, took its toll. She would often think back to the days before everything fell apart, wondering how her mother could have hidden such darkness beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Gabriel, still so young, struggled to find his place in a world where both his parents had betrayed him. The emotional scars left by the trial would follow them for the rest of their lives. As the dust settled on the trial, the community remained divided. Some saw Alejandro as a man who had been led astray, a victim of Camila's manipulation. Others believed that he, too, had a role to play in the tragedy, unable to escape the consequences of his own sin. But the most enduring question remained: what had truly driven Camila to orchestrate such a horrific act? Was it simply the desire for freedom? Or was there something deeper, a hunger for power and control that had been buried beneath her facade of faith and devotion? The unraveling of Camila's affair and her cold manipulation of Alejandro left an indelible mark on the community. It served as a reminder that even the most outwardly perfect lives could hide unspeakable darkness. The betrayal, the murder, and the trial all left the neighborhood grappling with the haunting realization that appearances could be deceiving, and that sometimes those we trust the most are the ones capable of the greatest harm. This reminds me of the case where the wife's affair with husband's grandfather ends in murder. Make sure you check out that ridiculous case, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates.